Hello, Euro nerds, and welcome to yet another installation in this lecture series. Today we will look at the second half of the 19th century, more specifically looking at the section of notes called New Imperialism. So please find this slide in your notebook. So first, this topic, hugely important, just from a citizen of the world perspective, from an AP Euro perspective, and additionally from a global history perspective. The Euro exam, the global history regions exam, place a decent amount of emphasis on new imperialism. There has actually been a DBQ on new imperialism for AP Euro before, so it's a pretty important topic. Again, from a global history regions perspective, I spent almost 2 months teaching this topic in Global 2, so gotta know it. And this set of notes, we're going to look at the generalities of new imperialism, the causes of it, and then we will look at examples of it in China, in India, and other parts of the world. So, let's start. First, we should probably define imperialism. I am sure you have read the word, I'm sure you've probably used the word, but it does help to actually have a definition here. So I always think of imperialism as like a pretty general term. So when someone talks about imperialism, you can be a colonization. Colonization is always part of imperialism, but sometimes imperialism is not exactly colonization. So for example, if a country economically imperializes another one, they don't have to colonize it, actually send their people over, take the land. They can just control it economically. They can control trade. They can control the political systems. They can install puppet rulers. Those are all examples of cultural, economic, political imperialism. Social imperialism, you're imposing your beliefs onto another culture. We're going to see plenty of examples of this in this time period. Specifically, also with this time period, I should note that this is really the heyday of imperialism and colonization. For example, the British Empire will be at its height basically by World War One, really at the end of World War One. So this time period is absolutely critical. Additionally, we should probably talk about why this is called new imperialism. Well, old imperialism was the stuff that we covered earlier on in the course. Think of Columbus. So this would be kind of the old imperialism time period right here, 1492 to somewhere in the 18th century. And the causes of it, well, a lot of them will actually be similarities. For example, with old imperialism, it was God, glory, gold. We are going to see similar economic, political, and social reasons with new imperialism. But we'll get into a little bit more specificity than probably we did with old imperialism here. So countries that we gotta know that will take part. So we already know Britain, France, classic. Then of course Belgium. So we're gonna look at a case study of the Belgian Congo, late 19th century. And then some interesting aspects. So we're not just talking about Westerners here. We're adding in Japan. So Japan is going to have a really interesting relationship with imperialism. We will see how they're initially forcibly opened up to trade. Again, that would be an example of imperialism. But then they essentially use that Westernization and modernization to their advantage, and then become an imperial and colonial power by the early 20th century. And additionally, the United States becoming an imperial power by late 1800s into the earlier 1900s, all the way really through World War II. So the areas that will be predominantly colonized will be most of Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia, and some parts of Asia, especially when it comes to colonization. Japan is going to colonize Korea, the eastern coast of China, South Asia, Southeast Asia, well, parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Indonesia, Philippines, various Pacific islands. So that's all going to be really leading into World War II. So again, this set of notes is so important for understanding world history. All right, so we'll start with causes. We'll get into economic, political, social causes. And first, let's start with economic. And this one is critical. You cannot talk about 19th century imperialism, new imperialism, without talking about the Industrial Revolution. They go hand in hand. So think about what the Industrial Revolution needs. It needs natural resources. It needs coal, it needs iron, needs cotton. So let's say Britain, for example, they actually already have a fair amount of coal and iron, so that's not necessarily a focus for them. They can't grow cotton in the British Isles. So eventually they're going to begin colonizing India, and India is going to be the largest producer of cotton in the entire world. So having natural resources to quite literally fuel industrialization is key. Honestly, you can't have imperialism without profit. That's the reason why it exists. Additionally, we have rubber. So rubber is going to be particularly important during the second industrial revolution. So rubber would be really important for, I don't know, cars. Cars will start being invented by the 1890s, will actually be much more widespread in their use by the early 20th century. So rubber is huge, also going to be used for like the actual machines in the factories, that all the gears and stuff, you need rubber to make those work. Yes, rubber actually is a naturally occurring thing. There are things called rubber trees. They're the largest concentration of them are in modern day Congo. It's kind of like the sap from the rubber trees can then be used in a vulcanization process to create rubber. Gold and diamonds, we already know about gold. Ivory, so diamonds, one of the largest producers of diamonds in the world will be just in the northern part of southern Africa. And ivory, we already know where that comes from, like the tusks of elephants, rhinoceroses. So again, that luxury trade is going to be critical. Additionally, always remember, like, we're still in this element of growing consumerism in the world, in Europe, the growing middle class, them wanting to show off their wealth. That's where diamonds, gold, and ivory come in. Next, it says expand markets for finished products. So let's use cotton, for example. So Britain and India, they're going to steal the cotton from Indians, send it back to Britain, weave it into textiles, so cotton cloth, and then they're going to sell it back to the people they just stole it from. They're effectively taking the money twice, or at least the value twice. So having additional areas to sell these goods is again going to lead to more and more profit. What else we got? Outlets needed for Europe's growing population. So this gets into colonialism. So actually sending people to another country, take it over, to live there. That's colonialism. Again, colonialism is always an example of imperialism. Countries we won't necessarily see colonization, but we will see imperialism, would be, for example, China and Japan. All right, next we have political causes. So here, we're going to look at really one part of it's going to be the competition between growing European powers. And I really like to think of political causes alongside nationalism. You can't talk about one without the other. So think about the relationship between Britain, France, Germany. They're all vying for more power. And that's all forms of nationalism. So key to understanding imperialism. So when you have a large colonial empire, it is key to have military bases in strategic parts of the world for refueling, having what they called coaling stations. So the naval ships they're using are all powered by steam engines. You need to have like strategic areas where they can get more coal and then continue on with the journey. Prestige Gold Empire, again, that's connected to nationalism. We already got that part. Boom, boom, boom. Put a star circle on the advanced weaponry. So a question they sometimes ask is, how were Europeans able to effectively take over so much land and control so many parts of the world? And the answer is they had really the best weaponry in the world. They're going to be taking over areas that are they're not industrialized. They're not using firearms. So sadly, they'll be pretty easy to take over. This section, super key. Underline Berlin Conference, circle it, star it, 100% gotta know. Even the Regents exam regularly asks questions about it. So, late 19th century, Otto von Bismarck organizes a conference in Berlin to set up, like, quote unquote, the rules for colonizing Africa. So he basically saw all the competition between European nations to take over different parts of Africa, and he thought it would lead to a European war, and he wanted to avoid that at all costs. So he organized this conference to basically like slice and dice Africa. Here's this British section, here's the German section, here's the French section, and this will really lead to what we call the scramble for Africa. And you can probably guess how many people from Africa were represented here. The answer is quite literally zero. And this setup, what will happen after the Berlin Conference, is really going to set up some parts of that continent to experience significant conflict later on in the 20th century. They're going to be drawing these arbitrary lines through ethnic groups, and often when you do that, you are setting the stage for ethnic conflict. So I'm thinking of like the Rwanda genocide of 1994. I'm thinking of the Sudanese Civil War, one of the longest running civil wars in human history. All these events that happened in the 20th century are related to European and directly resulted from European colonization. So before I go on, I just want to talk about this political cartoon because I've seen it appear quite a bit, whether it's the AP exam or even the Global Regions exam. That's pretty important. So the caption says, Punch cartoon depicting Cecil Rhodes and Britain's desire to control Africa. Punch was a satirical cartoon that Britain had for a long time. They actually have a lot of cool documents to look at. Nonetheless, Cecil Rhodes was a mining tycoon in Britain. So he owned a bunch of diamond mines right about here in southern Africa. And he started a company called De Beers Diamond Mines that still exists today. They're actually still the largest diamond mine corporation in the world. And his grand vision was to actually make a railway from the southern tip of Africa all the way to the northern tip, really up to Cairo, basically Cape Town to Cairo. And that would allow for a more efficient way of transporting goods, aka diamonds, other natural resources, from southern Africa to the Mediterranean, where they can eventually be sent to Britain. And additionally, look at the cartoon. Look at like how it's represented. He's like holding up these strings, almost like he's a puppeteer controlling the continent. That's ultimately the definition of colonization and imperialism is control. All right, there are a bunch of readings in this section of the notes. So again, for the sake of time, I'm just going to say pause this, read it yourself, and we will continue along. And lastly, for the causes of new imperialism, social. So first vocab word we're going to look at is social Darwinism. So we already know Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin wrote multiple books, most famous one, The Origin of Species, and eventually The Descent of Man, where he's saying that there's a survival of the fittest for organisms. Why are some organisms more likely to survive in a climate than others? So eventually his ideas get corrupted by a guy named Herbert Spencer. And they apply this idea of survival of the fittest to race. And they look at why are Europeans taking over part of the world, and Herbert Spencer would argue it's because they're a superior race. So this then gets applied to a term called the white man's burden. So there's actually a poem written The White Man's Burden, and it was written by Rudyard Kipling, yes, the same guy who wrote The Jungle Book, a book you probably read as a child, but yes, Rudyard Kipling was an imperialist. And the white man's burden really became an idea, and it became like the way Westerners legitimized their colonialism throughout the world. It's basically how they're saying this is why they should be doing it. So they're arguing that it's a burden or a duty for Westerners to spread their culture. By culture, we're talking about religion, so Christianity. Their modern technology, so talking about railways. Other parts of civilization, which can involve language. So think about how French is spoken in so many different parts of Africa. Same thing with English. Think about European universities being constructed in South Asia and India, parts of Africa. So those are all parts of what we call cultural imperialism, when you are forcibly applying your culture on somebody else's because you view yours as superior. So when you take all these terms here, I'm also thinking about a global one vocab word you were taught last year, which was ethnocentrism, the belief that your culture was superior to another's. So putting all this together, it's just straight up white supremacy. That's really what it is. It's just an addition to this term that we've been looking at throughout this course. All right, so this is a reading about those coaling stations I referenced earlier on. This section, so if you want some more details on what like Europeans are using for quote-unquote superior technology, this is going to give you plenty of examples. It's going to talk about really a perfected form of the machine gun that will be used during World War I eventually. All those little details that you can use potentially in SAQs, DBQs, LEQs, all the writing that we do. All right, so example number one of new imperialism, we're going to be looking at China and the First Opium War. There are two of them, but the first one is the particularly important one. So 1839, 1842. So let's look into our contextualization first. So first, it does say Europe. I'm going to be pretty specific to the British here. So Britain wants a ton of goods from China. Silk for clothes, fashion, we know that. Spices, because who wants to eat unspiced meats? Tea, ridiculously important. Think about tea with the British. Porcelain. So where do you put your tea in? Well, you need fine china, aka porcelain. And additionally, think of the context of growing middle class, growing consumerism. Having luxury items like fine porcelain shows off your wealth. So here's the issue. Britain can't really trade for any of these because China doesn't really want anything Britain has to offer. They have historically viewed other parts of the world as inferior. Again, form of ethnocentrism. We covered it last year in Global One in theory. And Britain needs to figure out a way to basically buy tea without losing a lot of money. Basically, Britain doesn't want an unfavorable balance of trade between itself and China. They want to make the most money possible. So their idea was, well, they should become one of the largest drug dealers in the world. So at this point in time, the British East India Company controls a good portion of India, and India is the largest producer of opium in the world. It comes from the red poppy, and it can be formulated into an extremely highly addictive drug, narcotic, that is still used in a lot of painkillers today. So Britain harvests the opium. British merchants then smuggle it to China. Well, actually, they send it to little islands off the coast of China and then sell it to Chinese merchants. And they would get silver in exchange. So Britain's selling opium to Chinese merchants in exchange. Now the British are getting silver. And silver is the only thing China would sell tea for. Britain cannot use any of its own goods to trade for tea. They have to basically buy it. So Britain is essentially using the silver they're getting from the Chinese who are buying the opium and then are going to use that silver to buy the tea. So what Britain does is they literally want Chinese people to get addicted to the opium first. So they first sell the opium at ridiculously low prices to the Chinese merchants who then smuggle it ashore, and they get a good portion of the population addicted to it. Then the British jack up the price and they make an incredible amount of profit. So eventually the Chinese government figures out what the British are doing, which is basically being the world's largest drug dealers, and they start finding these stores of opium on these islands, start burning it. Well, you start burning British goods, that's going to cause significant problems, especially in this time period. So effectively what Britain just did is they reversed a trade deficit in their own favor. Like, that is the definition of economic imperialism. So China actually declares war on Britain first. This leads to